Hello and welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Remember, in these videos, we take about 8 used firearms that have come into the store, either through our front door or through the website, and give you guys about a 2 to 4 minute review of each to give you guys an idea of some different stuff out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making this video to sell anything, to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. Anyway, guys, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our new website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please log on to our website and create an account. From there, you can submit your firearms for an offer request, which we will provide to you within about 24 hours. With that, you will get an offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell it to us. We do provide you with the shipping label. We also pay you with either a paper check or ACH direct deposit to make the process as seamless for you as possible. Remember, go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. Alright, remembering the format of this video is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses. Starting off, we have a firearm that comes to us from a viewer in Florida. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is a CZ83 pistol, which is the commercial export version of the CZ82, which was a standard issue military pistol from about 1983 to current day in Czechoslovakia, or I should say current day Czech Republic. Now, production on this would cease in about 1993, but they're still issued today. If we look at the history of this firearm, let's talk about Czechoslovakia at the time. They had always wanted to be independent when it came to their own arms manufacturing, design, and distribution, even though there were other similar COM-bloc countries at the time who took a lot of their production cues and designs from Russia. Russia would come out with things like the AK-47, the AKM, the SKS, the Tokarev, the Makarov, and other countries like China, Yugoslavia, Poland, Romania would take a lot of the same concept or firearm production and ammunition usage to basically have a standardization within those other sort of COM-bloc countries, if you will. Now, although Czechoslovakia did issue a lot of the same type of ammunition, they would really develop their own firearms separate from what was commonly being found in Russia, although the stylizing and function would be very similar. If we look at the AK-47, you could say the Czechoslovakian variant of that, or I guess you could say parallel to that, would be the VZ58 rifle, chambered in 7.62x39 as their standard assault rifle. If you look at the SKS, you could say the Czech variation of that would be the VZ52, chambered in 7.62x45 and also 7.62x39. Instead of the TT-33 Tokarev in 7.62x25, Czechoslovakia would have the VZ52 pistol, a really big sort of roller-locked pistol chambered in the same cartridge. And then if we look at the Makarov, a 9x18 Makarov, this could be argued to be the Czechoslovakian equivalent of that. You have a fixed barrel, straight blowback. This is a double single action pistol with the safety mounted on the frame, and it was chambered in the 9x18 Makarov round. Now, this would go into production, like I said, in 1983, would become the standard issue pistol, replacing the VZ52, and again would still be issued today. Now, at the time, about a year later, about 1983, 1984, they would come out with this, which was the CZ83, which is again a commercial export version, which would have been chambered in the more commercially found 380 ACP or 9mm Browning, which would be labeled on the firearm, or 32 automatic. Now, this one is a 380. Double stack magazine, again fixed blowback with a double single action trigger. Really accurate, really reliable, and actually very comfortable and ergonomic. A lot of people will pick these up in the CZ52s and use them for defensive carry firearms, and they used to be very inexpensive. Now, these would be imported into the country until about 2012. Now, they still import them as like military surplus and surplus cash from, you know, different police forces and stuff around the world. And, you know, we had a couple we had the CZ83s imported as police surplus, I believe. I can't remember from what country, but we got those in like 3 years ago. So you do still see those. as like retired police pistols and stuff like that. Pricing on the more surplus type stuff, we're finding them anywhere between $300 to $500 depending on the condition and what it comes with and stuff like that. Definitely, I would say the CZ82s have a little bit more of a collector following because of their military usage, but the CZ83s are still excellent pistols, as it is easier to find the 380 ammunition than it is 9x18 Makarov. And again, people do purchase them as really good concealed carry or truck gun type firearms, again, for their price, ruggedness, durability, and accuracy. So they are a really, really cool firearm. If you're looking for something that's a little bit different, fun to shoot on the range and not super expensive, you might look into a surplus 82 or 83 pistol, but really, really cool nonetheless. This one's in excellent condition. So again, really happy to get this one in. Okay, up next I have a pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Nevada. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. And this one is sort of a blast from the past in sort of the late 80s, early 90s time frame. But this is a Spanish Star Firestar 9mm pistol. Comes with one single stack magazine, chambered in 9mm. Now the 9mm version was the M49. They would make it in a 40 called the M40. A 45 called the M45, and a double stack 9mm variation called the M249, not to be confused with the squad automatic rifle. As mentioned, this would start coming in at about the late 80s and would be imported exclusively by Inner Arms. Now, for the price, the firearm was always regarded as having been a really good, reliable backup or concealed carry option through the early 90s. In fact, in 1991, this pistol was actually awarded Handgun of the Year from Guns and Ammo magazine. Now, unfortunately, in 1994, Star Benefacio, the manufacturer of this pistol in Spain, would actually file for bankruptcy and close its doors. They were actually struggling with bankruptcy as they were bringing these things in the early 1990s. So this was sort of one of their last hurrahs as a firearm that they would have been producing. And Star had always been known for creating really good, affordable, mainly concealed carry firearms. Of course, they had full-size firearms as well that tended to sort of model around the 1911 stylization. Similar to this, it sort of looks like a compact 1911, although there are many functional differences, like no grip safety, does have a manual safety, single action only, manual safety that functions on the hammer being in the back position like a 1911, but very, very similar. So even though the function is different, the ergonomics are similar enough to where people who like 1911s typically do tend to like their products and gravitate towards the Star products. But even though they are sort of a token of the past, no longer around, they do make really cool classic collectibles for people who were ingrained in the firearm community through the late 80s, early 90s, as because of their price point, these are pretty prevalent to find in gun shops, gun shows, and things like that. Today on the current market, they're still not super expensive. You should be able to pick up something like this between about the $400 to $500 mark. So again, for something that actually does still make a very functional firearm, it's a little bit heavy and large for what it is in terms of capacity. Coming in at a 7-round capacity, 9mm. Still fun, something a little bit different to take to the range. So interesting to get this one in. Happy to share it with you guys here. Okay, up next, I have a firearm that comes to us from a viewer here in Indiana. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is an FM Hi Power, which is the Argentinian version of the FN Hi Power. Now, the Hi Power was actually a design of John Moses Browning, which he actually did not see through to the end of completion, as he would co-opt this with FN in Belgium. Now, this would actually come out in its first iterations in about 1935. A lot of different countries that adopted this would know this as the P35. Pistol 9mm, double stack, single action only, somewhat similar or related to the 1911 concept. Now, during World War II, this firearm design would be used by several different countries. Germany would capture production of these, issuing them again as the P35 chambered in 9mm. You can get them with Waffen amps and things like that on them, and they do collect somewhat of a premium. You would have the Canadian Ingles version, which again was a variation of the Hi Power as well. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, these would continue to be very famous in non-com bloc countries, continue to be very popular and regarded as one of the best handguns throughout, that period of the 40s through the 60s and 70s, as things would start getting replaced through the 70s and 80s with things like the CZ75s and the Berettas and polymer handguns and things like that. So sort of in that post-war to Cold War era, again, unless you're in the com bloc countries, the Hi Power was one of the most common that you would see in military service. Now, That would not exclude countries like Argentina, who are also interested in this firearm as well. In 1960, Argentina would commission FN to do a short production run on high powers for their military. They would receive that small batch of firearms, look them over, and decide that it was definitely the direction they wanted to go in the future. However, they wanted to produce them domestically. Now, their domestic arms manufacturing house, which was FM, as stated here on the side of this slide, would actually take up production under license from FN, and FN would actually have overseers, if you will, in the FM factories, sort of overwatching production, making sure that the production standards were met to keep the quality up with the FN high power model. This would happen through about 1969 through 1989, and then in 1990 they would come up with a non-licensed export version called the M90, same firearm but with some production shortcuts that were taken, deletion of the lanyard loop. You would have a little bit simplified cuts right up here on the top of or right up here at the front of the slide. You would maintain the same manganese phosphate finish that they would use on their military and domestic police pistols, but otherwise they were more or less the same. Now, even though they were a non-licensed manufactured version of the high power, the part standardization was still pretty consistent with the ones that they had produced for the previous 20 years under FN license and observation. So the pistols are still really relatively known for good quality and, again, parts interchangeability, unlike things like the Hungarian FEG copies of the high power. In collector circles, they are not regarded as being super collectible as things made in Belgium or Portugal would be, but they still do have a following, and they are still technically of the high power family. You could get these things recently in about the $300 range. They have crept up to about the $400 to $500 mark, which is typically about where you find them right now. Now, this particular one has been gone through and has had a lot, basically completely overhauled and turned into more of a target type gun, if you will, or a more modernized firearm. The barrel has been replaced, the sight's been replaced with night sights. It does have this, let's see if I can do this, what's called the RDIH hammer and safety system, which is pretty interesting. If you're familiar with the Daewoo pistols, which do have a hammer, you can actually push it back physically into somewhat of like a double action position, even though this is not a double action pistol. You pull down on the safety lever and it re-engages you back to the single action. So if you want to chamber a round and carry with the round in the chamber without having it on single action, you can kind of push it back into a safety notch. When you draw the pistol, you push down on the safety lever and it does bring it back to the single action position, ready to fire. So an interesting concept. All the springs and everything have been completely overhauled. All the original parts and everything are with the firearm, so I do have the original barrel springs and everything to revert it back, and the original grips. Now, the M90 series did have the plastic grips as opposed to the traditional wood, although this one did come with traditional wood, original FN high power grips, so interesting. But this can be reverted back to factory condition. But anyway, really interesting pistol. I do like high powers of any variety. This one, coming from Argentina, has a little bit of an interesting history, so really happy to get that in and share it with you. All right, up next is a rifle that comes to us from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a rifle number 4 Mark II. Now, the history with this would actually begin back pretty much, we could say, around 1907. Now, there were earlier variations of the SMLE prior to the number 1 Mark III and Mark III Star, but the primary version that most people are familiar with, having served through the First World War, would be the number 1 Mark III and Mark III Star, chambered in .303 British. Now, it did have a short magazine Lee Enfield, typical characteristics. You had your cock on close, giving you that really quick bolt throw, 10-round detachable box magazine, .303 British, iconic nose cap up here at the front. Really nice, popular rifles. Now, through about the 1930s, Great Britain decided that it wanted to revamp the rifle line. Again, this was prior to the advent of World War II. They wanted to come out with something that was a little bit cheaper and easier to produce. They would come out with a trials throughout the 1930s, where they would then land on the rifle number 4 series of rifles, beginning with the number 4 Mark I, which was adopted in 1941 as World War II was kicking off and Britain decided it needed something to quickly get into. Now, in 1942, they would come up with a further simplified version called the number 4 Mark I Star. They would do things like redesign the bolt catch. They would go from the brass butt plate to a zinc alloy, just doing things to simplify and make production cheaper, easier, quicker, to get them out quickly in the field. There were different manufacturers of these. Of course, these would be issued, the Enfield rifles would be issued for Britain. A lot of the Commonwealth countries, you had production in Australia with Lithgow. Those again would be on the number 1 series or pattern. You would have Long Branch in Canada, and actually Savage in the United States, making them for Lend-Lease for Britain as well. And of course, the pricing and variations of those are going to change, depending on the manufacturer, condition, and all that sort of thing. Then you had the number 4 Mark II. Now the Mark II would actually be a post-war revised variation of the rifle, which is what this is. The main difference was how the trigger was hung. The earlier variations in number 4 Mark I and Mark I Star would be hung on the trigger guard. These would actually have a brazed block underneath the wood line here, which this would be mounted to, giving you a little bit of a more rigid trigger, which some people would argue is a better trigger. That's up for debate depending on what camp you fall into, but definitely perceived to be an improvement of the rifle, and again would be used post-World War II, about 1949 and so on, and onward. This one is a 1949. Pricing on the Enfield line is going to depend on the mark, the condition, the matching numbers. Typically you'll have a number on the stock, the magazine, the bolt, and the receiver. And the pricing can be all over the place based on that. Most commonly where you would find most of your Enfields or shooter grade Enfields are going to be stabilizing around the $400 to $600 mark, depending on condition, matching parts, and stuff like that. They can go up from there based on manufacturer, again, the mark, the rarity, things like that. I do have at my disposal a lot of different Enfields, so I'd like to do a more in-depth, involved video on this topic, but at least that's sort of a quick summary for the purposes of the weekly used gun review. But really happy to get this one in. They're not too commonly seen Mark II, but there it is, and again, really happy to share it with you. Okay, up next is a pretty classic pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Idaho, so thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is the Beretta 81 series, model 85 FS Cheetah, which was designed by Beretta, again as part of the 81 series of pistols in 1976. Now from that series, you have the 81 and 82, which are chambered in .32 automatic, and then the 83, 84, and 85 chambered in .380. Now the 84 was a double stack, but the 83 and 85 were single stacks, which is what this is. Now of those, you have the sub-variants, the B, the BB, the F, and the FS. The latest being the FS, which is what this is. So this is sort of the most modern iteration of the Cheetah lineup in .380. Now, again, these would be manufactured in 1976 until about 2017. They went on a short production hiatus, and then they actually still come into the country now today. And you can buy them brand new, but they do come in very, very limited production runs. So even though they are still manufactured today, they are not too easy to come by brand new. And even on the brand new market, you typically find them between $700 and $800, and that's about where the used market is on them in really good condition with their original boxes. Typically, they would come, and I have them around here. I don't know where they are, but the typical black plastic Beretta grips, and these are factory Beretta wood grips as well. Again, single stack being the model 85, and it is in a straight blowback, single double action with a safety decocker mounted right here onto the frame. It also does have a magazine disconnect, so magazine must be inserted for the firearm to function. Really cool, really classic pistols. Again, most people are going to be purchasing these for the collectability and the shootability aspects of them. They don't really stack up much against other concealed carry pistols in the modern day and age in terms of weight and size. But in terms of collectability, the Cheetah has been a classic staple of the Beretta line since, again, the 1970s, keeping the traditional stylizing of the pistol lineup with the top eject that you typically see on the 92 series of pistols as well in the larger frame. So really, really cool classic pistols. Happy to get this one in. There's always people out hunting for the Cheetah pistols, and this is just a really good condition one to have. Okay, up next is a very unique pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Texas. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. If you are familiar with World War II history, especially World War II Japanese history, you definitely know what this is. This is a Type 14 Nambu, chambered in the 8mm Nambu cartridge. Now, if we go back to the late 1800s, Japan had been issuing the Type 26 service revolver. A lot of different nations at the time had been issuing a service revolver, but as we're moving in through the 1900s, a lot of countries, especially in the West, are moving into semi-automatic pistols. Now, Japan, I actually have a full-length video on the Japanese Type 11, which talks a lot about the Japanese military doctrine at the time, but they're taking a lot lot of cues from Western military advancement, and like the machine guns and the pistols as well, they want to move into a semi-automatic pistol design. Now, Kajiro Nambu was somewhat of the John Moses Browning of Japan at the time. He had come up with a lot of their pistol designs, their machine gun designs, and he had come up with a variation of the pistol you see here. What we colloquially know today as collectors as the Grandpa Nambu. It's a very complicated, difficult to manufacture, and expensive to manufacture pistol chambered in the 8mm Nambu round. It was also known as the Type A. Now, they would do a revision of this very quickly after adoption, simplifying production. That would be known as the Papa Nambu to many as well. Now, the Grandpa Nambus are very, very expensive. You find those in original condition with original stocks and everything. They can go upwards of $11,000 to $20,000. The Papa Nambus are still a little bit tough to find, but they're typically a lot less expensive and really good condition. You might find those for about $2,000 to $3,000. There was a Type B known as the Baby Nambu by collectors, which was chambered in the 7mm Nambu round, which is a scaled down smaller version. Now, in 1926, which happened to be the 14th year of Emperor Taisho's reign, which is Japanese calendar is based on taking the first year of the emperor who is currently in power. You add on to it and the succession of the years, and that's how you get the type. So the Type 14 being the 14th year of Emperor Taisho's reign, when this would go into production on the Western calendar, would be 1926, which is when you have the standardization of this, which was a lot more common and a lot more produced, at about 400,000 units estimated being produced. Now, in Japanese military, this typically officers would be allowed to carry sidearms, but at the time they would have to purchase their own. A lot of them would want to stay with the nationalistic pride of purchasing something made in Japan, so a lot of them would carry the Type 14 Nambus. Later on, Kajiro Nambu would design the Type 94, which again is a more simplified design with an exterior trigger bar, which, you know, I'll roll in a picture. We can talk about those. I have one of those I can show you. But very, very interesting, very unique pistol designs. Because of that, you would also find things like the Colt 1903 in Japanese service as well, because a lot of the Japanese officers would choose to purchase more Western pistol designs, as in many cases they were better, just plain and simple. Very, very large, beefy, weird, awkward design, awkward disassembly, but really, really cool from a collector standpoint nonetheless. These would be produced all the way up until the end of World War II, this particular one being produced in 1944, so towards the end of the war. And as the war would progress, of course, as Japan would start to lose the war, degradation of the quality of their machine guns, their pistols, their rifles would ensue. This is a later war, very crude design. You would have earlier sort of a honeycomb cut in the cocking knob here. That's how you would cock the pistol. You pull back on this and release and fire. This one does need a little bit of work. There's some weak springs and stuff, so this one's not quite functional. You would have a later trigger guard here due to the some troops complaining about the smaller trigger guard. You couldn't get gloved hands inside the trigger guard, so they would enlarge that as time would go on as well. Again, if you figure out the calendar year, this is dated 19.77 would be July, but 19 you have you add that onto Emperor, or it would be Emperor Hirohito. So in 1925, Emperor Hirohito plus 19 would be 1944 on the Western calendar, would be the manufacturer of this. So a very, very late production Nambu. Really, really cool. This one is a matching example. They're not super expensive. I mean, the price range on these is all over the board, depending on, matching parts, if it's got a holster, but they are really, really not that pricey. Really, really, really good condition. They might top out at about $1,000, but, in much more crude, poor condition, this one is a lot of patina, some pitting, stuff like that. Again, some needs to be some replaced parts and stuff like that. It's going to be quite a bit less. But anyway, just wanted to share that one with you, and thank you again to our viewer in Texas for sending that one along to us. So there is a Japanese Type 14 Nambu. Okay, up next is a really collectible pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Illinois. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is the Swiss P49 as adopted by Switzerland in 1949. Now, the story with this would begin actually back in about 1901 with the Swiss adoption of a variation of the Luger, which they called the Model 1900, and it was chambered in 7.65 by 21. Now, by about the time of World War II, Switzerland, like Germany or other countries that adopted variations of the Luger, had really looked at the Luger as antiquated technology. It was expensive to manufacture, time-consuming to manufacture, was prone to stoppages in the field, and was really part of this first wave of new semi-automatic pistols that were becoming popular at the turn of the century. By about the 1940s, it's really being looked at as antiquated technology. So Switzerland, like a lot of other countries, wants to move into a more modern pistol. So in the late 1940s, SIG does a trial with about 12 different pistol designs and would ultimately land on this. Now, the inspiration for this was the Model 1935A SACM pistol coming out of France. Of course, some changes were made to it, which really led into this design concept of a pistol. Now, there were 5 different model variations that were produced between 1949 and 1975, when this would ultimately be replaced by the SIG Model P220 as a Model 1975 in the Swiss military. Now, between 1949 and 1975, again, 5 variations of this would be produced, this being the most common and this being the 5th variation. You can tell that it's a 5th variation from sort of the duo-tone finish. It does have serrated slide stop as opposed to the earlier checkered variations. The plastic paneled grip panels over here on the side. The first through third would typically be a very rich bluing wood grip scales. The 4th variation would look like this, but you could tell the difference between the 4th and the 5th because the 4th had the checkered slide stop. The 5th would be serrated. But anyway, these are really regarded as very, very nice and probably one of the best made service sidearms that has ever been issued by any military, even to today. A lot of people still use these in competition. The civilian version that most people, that you can actually buy today would be the SIG Model P210, which is essentially this. But the military variations are still very collectible and excellent pistols. You know, it was adopted by the Swiss military when there is an A letter prefix, as you see here. If it had a P, it was either adopted for private use or police service. But anyway, yeah, there is that. So a military adopter, a military variation, Model P49. These are getting pretty pricey on the private market. If we look at a 5th variation like this, again, the most common, in really good condition, you might be in about the $2,000 range. Now, the earlier variations, the models of variations 1 through 3 can get upwards of over $3,000 in good condition. So this one is an all-matching example, slide frame and barrel. Overall, really, really nice. So really happy to get that in and share it with you guys. If you ever get a chance to pick up one of these or a Model P210, they are excellent handguns, very light trigger. Single action only. It's just very nice. So yeah, anyway, happy to get that in and share it with you guys. All right, last but not least, I have a really interesting machine gun that comes to us from Arizona. And yes, on our website, we do buy transferable machine guns, which is what this is. This is a Model 1917 A1 belt-fed water-cooled machine gun chambered in .30-06, and it was designed by John Moses Browning. Now, in the year 1900, John Moses Browning has secured the patent for a recoil-operated machine gun. Prior to that, he had a patent for a gas-operated machine gun, which was known as the 1895 potato digger, which is really a colloquial name for it. You had an arm that extruded underneath the barrel, and when the firearm was fired, escaping gases were trapped, would actuate the rod and cycle the action. He had been watching his brother shooting on a gun range. He noticed the weeds and the grass moving when the rifle was fired, noticed that escaping gases and lost energy was being used, which he could harness and put back into the firearm to actuate it. From that, he came up with a recoil-operated machine gun concept, which was this. Now, again, I mentioned that he secured the patent in 1900, but did not really start developing this until about 1910. Now, he had been looking at other machine gun concepts that were being developed at the time, most notably the Maxim, and then of course the Vickers, which was much related to the Maxim design. Wanted to make something that was a little bit easier to produce, a little bit more simple, had fewer moving parts, so he would come up with this concept, recoil operated, larger parts, fewer of them, and there is actually a very simple machine gun concept. He would come up with this. He went to the ordnance board. The first variation was not water cooled, and he was able to demonstrate that it could be fired for a pretty sustained amount of time with very limited stoppages. So it actually did end up getting adopted, but was not really put into wide-scale production until about the tail end of World War I. So the first variation, the Model 1917, saw very limited use at the end of the war. Now, one of the problems they noticed with the model 1917, especially in this rear receiver area, is it would be prone to cracking and kind of premature wearing in here. So in the 1930s, they redesigned the receiver section and added on this riveted plate, which would reinforce the bottom portion of the receiver, stopping it from cracking. Now, it would be used in the United States military in the interwar period, but would not really gain a whole lot of fame until the early stages of World War II. Now, these would be seen in the Pacific Theater. Most notably, it was used in Guadalcanal. 2 Marines were acclaimed with the Medal of Honor for their use of the 1917 A1. That's Mitchell Page and John Basilone. And they were machine gun section leaders. Now, the heavy machine gun variant, which was the 1917 A1, was employed at the battalion level as a heavy machine gun, which was known for being set up on a tripod, which I do have, but not currently here on the table in front of you. It typically take a small team of people to maneuver the tripod, and it was meant to be set up in more of a defensive role without having much movement available to it. It was very heavy, difficult to move around, so you'd set it up, typically interlaced with other 1917 A1s, to create a pretty consistent field of fire. Of course, they would be advanced when a position was taken and so on and so forth. It was not a maneuverable medium or a light machine gun for an offensive use, again, mainly in the defensive role. You would fill the jacket with water, and with the water jacket, watering can and hose, and a good supply of ammunition, it could be really fired for a very long period of time without any type of critical issues happening to the barrel, the receiver, the trunnion, or anything like that. Now, a air-cooled variation, a more maneuverable and more medium machine gun type, was developed out of this concept known as the 1919, most notably seen as the 1919 A4 and A6. The A4 being mounted on a tripod, the A6 being even more maneuverable, moved to a bipod. I have a video on the 1919 A6 if you want to go watch it. And the rest is sort of history. Now, the 1917 A1 would stay in military service all the way up through the Vietnam War, which is actually one of the longest living machine guns that has been used in the United States military. So really, really cool service history. This here would mount into the cradle. This pintle would mount into the cradle on the mount. So you typically leave that in there and just insert it. But it's very heavy top cover that, try to do this from a weird angle. This would pop up and open. You load in your belt here, of course, close the top cover, cycling the action. And again, you can go back and see, here's the extractor. You can go back and see I have a full detailed video on the 1919 A6 that shows the operation of this machine gun. It's basically the operating system is the same. I will hold on to this and do some videos with this, rounding out sort of a complete selection of the United States military firearms with this. I can do some pretty interesting videos, so I'll try and do that and do a more dedicated at-length video showing disassembly, shooting, and stuff like this in the future. So anyway, really, really cool firearm, and happy to get that in. And that is the Browning M1917 A1. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button, and please also consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting new content. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you off there. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.